Chapter 11. Dimensions are people too. Franklin walked the halls of Lacumat, rubbing his forehead. He wished that for just one day nothing remotely exciting would happen to him. Years ago, when his life had been completely uninteresting, he had, of course, longed for the exact opposite, and he knew that he was proving the age-old human contradiction of man only wanting whatever he didn't have. But he didn't care. Back when he had wanted a more exciting life, he never would have imagined robots trying to kill him or his name having anything to do with his fate. And when he had tried to go back to that life, it had made him unhappy. All he could do now, it seemed, was wait around and see what new, bizarre situation would land in his lap next, and try not to get killed. If that was the life that truly made him happy, he thought, perhaps he was the one who needed a shrink. Franklin stopped at Bethany's desk to pick up the paperwork on his new patient. He looked over the pages for a moment and then glanced up at her in dismay. "Do you even check these before you give them to me?" Franklin asked. "I know, some of the answers don't make sense, but the guy was really weird. He made me kinda uncomfortable." Franklin laid the paper down in front of her and pointed at the species field. The patient had scribbled the words, "half Jexarite." "What does that mean?" Franklin said. "Did he look like a Jexarite?" "Oh yeah," said Bethany. "I saw the scales and the double layer of teeth." "Then what's the other half?" "He didn't say. Maybe he's got some Cherokee in him or something." Franklin shook his head and walked toward his office. "Hey, look on the bright side," Bethany called from behind him. "At least he's not an HR-120. Mr. Hast was a short, chubby man with pale green, scaly skin and a depressed expression on his face. Without the advantage of telepathy, it was difficult to determine whether or not he was actually depressed. Many of Franklin's patients looked especially troubled at their first session, and sometimes they weren't upset at all. Some of them seemed to think that they couldn't be justified in going to a therapist unless they at least looked like they were on the edge of suicide. It was like being embarrassed to go to the doctor's office because you weren't sure if anything was really wrong with you. Franklin got up from behind his desk and held out his hand, greeting Hast. "It's good to meet you," he said. Hast hesitated. "Do they not shake hands in your dimension?" Franklin asked. "No," said Hast. "We butt heads. But that's not it. I just make it a habit not to get too close to people." Franklin offered him a seat on his leather armchair and pulled out his clipboard. "Why is that, Mr. Hast?" "It's Borflostmakite, Dr. Bryce." Franklin's eyes widened. Borflostmakite was listed on the patient sheet as Hast's first name, but Franklin had avoided saying it because it was so long and hard to pronounce. Even after Hast said it out loud, Franklin didn't know if he could get the whole thing out. "If it's all the same to you, I think I'll stick with your last name. After all, we only have an hour." Franklin smiled, but Hast didn't find his joke funny at all. As Franklin looked down at Hast's paperwork, which he had only skimmed before, he noticed that the Jexarite had an anger management problem. Franklin made a mental note to stop trying to be funny. Hast had a lot of very sharp teeth. "I have a secret," Hast announced. "One I've been living with my entire life." "Go on," Franklin said. "You deal with people like me all the time, right? People who are different?" "Yes, I do. And it's understandable that you feel that way. You're a stranger from another dimension. It must be difficult fitting in here." "I'm not talking about that. I'm the only one of my kind, Dr. Bryce." "I don't understand. I'm not just a Jexarite. I'm something else, too." Franklin nodded. "You wrote on your file that you're only half Jexarite, but I certainly can't tell just by looking at you. Is that your secret?" "The other half isn't a species. It's something else." Franklin doodled on his clipboard. He was afraid Hast was about to get metaphorical, and he wanted to look engaged. "When I get angry, something happens to the people around me. That's why I'm afraid to get too close." "Oh, they don't respond well to your anger." "Well, no. They disappear." "They what?" "They disappear, and they don't come back until I get angry again." "I'm afraid I'm not following you." Hast hesitated. "They get sucked inside of me like a vacuum, and then later they get blown back out again." Franklin couldn't tell if this was still a metaphor or if Hast was serious. He drew a large question mark in the middle of his paper. "I'm a dimension," said Hast. Franklin slowly looked up and dropped his pen. "You're, I know how it sounds." Franklin opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He tried to make eye contact with Hast to show he was taking him seriously, but he couldn't stop his eyes from darting around the room. This was too much, even for his brain to wrap around. Half's face grew longer than it already was. You don't believe me. A dimension? I promise you I'm not making this up. Franklin grasped around his head for words, but he ultimately decided this was one of those times in which saying nothing was far preferable to saying anything. Go on, he said. It's hard enough being a Jexarite, shedding your skin every 6 months, growing a second set of eyes. You have another set of... We'll have, in about a year. Oh, congratulations. Thanks. I've heard it really hurts. Oh, sorry to hear it, but go on. Mr. Halfs paced the floor. I've never known how to deal with it. When people find out, they get scared. Sometimes they hate me. I can't keep friends. I'm an outcast in Jexar, a freak of nature. Franklin wasn't sure what would be the appropriate thing to say next, so he decided to fall back on a classic. And how does that make you feel? It makes me angry. Do you have any idea how it happened? None. My parents are outcasts, just like I am. Ever since I started sucking people into myself, their lives haven't been the same. No one wants anything to do with someone with an unstable dimension for a son, even now that I'm fully grown and on my own. And no one who knows what I am wants anything to do with me. But sometimes when I think about that, I get mad, and then the whole thing starts all over again. I need to control my anger. Maybe I can stop it, for good. Will you help me? Of course I will, said Franklin. He took a deep breath and hoped he could make good on his word. That's what I do. Franklin was looking at the longest table that he could recall ever seeing. The room seemed to have been built around the huge mahogany conference table, which was so long that at least 20 slightly overweight people could be seated on either side of it, but it was only wide enough so that just one normal-sized person could sit on each end. The first time Franklin had attended a meeting in this office, he had thought the table size a little excessive, considering it was an office, not a conference room, and the office was only occupied by a single individual. That was, of course, until he met that individual, Dr. Akbar Kaslam IV, office manager and head therapist of Vlachtermat's Abbott City branch. Kaslam was a Macvarian, and he was basically an accordion, sans the buttons and keys, with legs, arms at his furthest ends, and a cone-shaped head in the center. His skin was a pearl white. In his natural state, Dr. Kaslam was as long as the table in his office, and while he was far more comfortable at this length, he had the ability to compress his segmented body so that he could fit in or through anything a normal-sized human being could. Franklin had always wondered what kind of fantastic material Kaslam's suits must have been made out of, and how he kept his ties from wrinkling up. But he never asked for fear of being impolite. Suffice it to say, Dr. Kaslam was not as wide as he was long. Dr. Kaslam slinked his way into a spacious top-floor office where Franklin, Dr. Ava Creel, and Dr. Drake R. Drake were already seated at the conference table. They all sat on one side together, with several chairs between them. Dr. Kaslam gracefully came to his full length, his specially tailored gray suit stretching out along with his body, and he sat down on a matching wood bench the length of the table. His large, melon-like head remained at the center of his body, and his arms stretched out like his torso did, so that he could reach the file folder in front of him. He opened it and called the meeting to order. This meeting has been called to discuss the future of Helena Kathryn, said Dr. Kaslam. He spoke in his usual high-pitched voice, but his expression was a somber one. He didn't seem to like what was happening with Helena any more than Franklin did. Franklin, you said that Helena has requested that we look into the possibility of extracting her multiple personalities, Kaslam said. Franklin nodded slowly. Yes, she has. But you've also stated in your reports that there is no evidence of any sort of psychosis. You believe these personalities were put in or programmed in by whoever or whatever brought Helena into existence. That's the most reasonable conclusion, given tests run by Dr. Krill, Dr. Drake, and myself. Kaslam looked more serious and suddenly dropped his formal tone. Franklin, is this even a patient we should be handling? I'm sorry? Helena has no mental illness. She isn't the problem. The other 6 women in her mind are. I'm pretty sure, Dr. Krill said, that I can get rid of those personalities for you. Franklin took a deep breath and fought the temptation to glare at her. I've spoken with several of her personalities already, he said. They each have their own emotions, opinions, and ambitions. And what if those emotions are just simulated? Dr. Krill asked. What if someone programmed that homicidal maniac to take control of her body and attack any female therapist who happens to have a pet velociraptor? Yes, Dr. Krill, said Franklin sarcastically. I'm sure that's exactly what happened. You get my point. But what if those emotions are genuine, said Franklin. We can't just eradicate 6 sentient personalities. You're gonna make an ethical dilemma out of this, aren't you, Dr. Bryce, said Krill. She adjusted her fluffy Rebzothian hat, which seemed entirely unnecessary since it was floating 2 or 3 inches above her head. I think it already is, Franklin responded. I tend to agree, said Dr. Caslam. If there is a chance that these personalities are somehow self-aware, we have an obligation to not harm them. And if that's the case, it may be that those 6 personalities are whom we should be giving psychiatric attention to, not Helena herself. If any of them agrees to that, we have to help, no matter the risk. We have all taken the oath. All 4 of them raised their right hands. To aid the confused, the obsessed, and the psychotic, said Franklin. The depressed, the uncertain, and the insane, said Drake. The suicidal, the compulsive, the otherwise mentally ill, and anyone else who is unfit to counsel or perform therapeutic services on him or herself, said Caslam. The 3 of them all looked to Krill to finish the credo. She sighed. As long as they are sentient and able to communicate in some fashion, regardless of race or races, gender or lack of gender, dimension of birth, religious beliefs or lack thereof, favorite color, or the possibility that they have been genetically engineered, or are robots, or are a combination of several robots. You know, I'm starting to wonder if we shouldn't talk to headquarters about rethinking that last part, Drake said. But Franklin, said Dr. Caslam, getting back to the problem at hand, precautions must be taken. We must avoid another incident like what happened last week. Helena is still in a holding dimension, said Dr. Krill, to keep her from trying to kill me. I hope you're not thinking of canceling that particular precaution. I'd like to, Caslam said. Considering what she's done for this office, I don't like treating her like a prisoner. Franklin trusts her, and I trust his judgment on this. And I trust your trust, said Dr. Krill. But we can't trust the other personalities. True, but if it weren't for Helena Kathryn, Dr. Groffman might still have complete control of this facility with his threatnoidian persuasion powers. We all owe her a great debt. I'll be sure to send her a thank you card, Franklin could barely hear Krill say under her breath. It'll have a picture of a velociraptor eating a robot on the front. Dr. Caslam either failed to hear her comment or chose to ignore it. He said to her, Do you believe you can extract the personalities without destroying them? Well, I've never done it, of course. I'm certain I can get them out. I just don't know what will happen to them if I do. I can usually save memories, but personalities? I can't promise anything. At the moment, Dr. Caslam said, Helena is regrettably too dangerous to be allowed free movement about Vlachtermat. Hopefully you can make some progress with the other personalities, Franklin. Krill gave Franklin a look. He knew she hoped that Caslam would either send Helena away from Vlachtermat, or at the very least, order the personality extraction. She didn't consider Helena to be a person at all. Krill was the coldest human being Franklin had ever met, and he wondered why and how she ever became a therapist. I leave it in your capable hands, Caslam said. If there is a better solution than extracting her personalities, I'm certain you'll find it. But ultimately, Franklin, the decision will be yours. I cannot, in good conscience, allow Helena to make this decision on her own. You have the support of everyone here. Good luck. Ava Krill's face reddened. She stood up and leaned over the table, practically sneering at Caslam. You have to order the extraction, she said. Dr. Caslam remained cool and collected. The last time I checked, I was the one in charge, and you were thinking about resigning. She may be in a holding dimension now, Krill said, but she comes here every day for her sessions. Forget the damned oath. What if she escapes Dr. Bryce's office? And what about the HR-120s? They didn't show up until Helena Kathryn did. Obviously, they're connected to her. She's more dangerous than anyone is admitting. Surely you can see that. What I see, Dr. Krill, said Caslam, is your failure to understand the delicate nature of this situation. We have the most equipped and secured facility in the city. Vlachtermat has been threatened, attacked, shrunk to the size of a walnut, and sucked into another dimension. And yet here it still stands today. Each of those incidents happened because we insisted on helping someone too dangerous to be involved with. Each time we managed to survive, and each time we helped the patient to live a better life. Every branch of Vlachtermat in every dimension has this policy, and I refuse to change it here. Krill opened her mouth, paused for a moment, and then closed it in defeat. Once Kaslam's mind was made up, there was nothing in the multiverse that could change it. She slumped back in her chair so abruptly that a Repzothian hat failed to follow. It floated ahead of her, nowhere near her head, until she grabbed it in an embarrassed huff and put it back in place. Kaslam stretched out his slinky-like arm, picked up a large plastic bowl from the center of the table, and passed it around. That's all I have today. Thank you all for coming. Enjoy a lollipop on your way out. After they had all left Dr. Kaslam's office, Franklin caught up with Drake and stopped him in the hallway. He was nearly half a foot taller than Franklin, a few years older, and he wore a thinly trimmed goatee. They had been acquaintances for the last 3 years, since Drake was transferred from another branch of Lactermat in the Rekvaloskian dimension, although he wasn't a Rekvaloskian himself. All Franklin really knew about Drake was that he had lived in over a dozen different dimensions, that he specialized in interdimensional computer technology, and that he was really, really lucky. "I have a question for you," said Franklin. "Shoot. Have you ever met a dimension?" Drake raised an eyebrow. "Is this a trick question?" "No. I know it's bizarre, but I had a new patient today who claims he's a dimension. That's not possible." "I know it sounds strange, but impossible? Considering some of the things I've seen, I find that unlikely. Stranger things have happened." No, they really haven't. A living dimension defies everything we know about the multiverse. If you think of reality as a blanket, dimensions are all threads of that blanket. They're all connected, which is why portals can open from one dimension to another. Dimensions are networked, like computers. So if a dimension was a living being and it went inside another dimension, that dimension wouldn't be part of the network anymore, which would probably cause the whole thing to break down. "But the patient works like a dimension," said Franklin. "He can suck people into himself, just like an open portal." "Well, there must be some other explanation. He can't be a dimension." "You're sure?" "Positive." "But you could be wrong." "No." "Why?" "Because I'm Drake R. Drake." Franklin folded his arms. "Now you're just being arrogant." Drake laughed at his joke and they said goodbye. Franklin knew he was probably right. Drake was practically never wrong. Having the same 2 first names had the opposite effect on a person as having 2 different first names. It made Drake the luckiest kind of man in the multiverse.